The main body of Britain is an island called Great Britain, which is the ninth largest island in the world. However, before the Romans first landed here around the 1st century BC, there was no reliable written history. In other words, it didn't form any civilization at all. But long ago, during the Stone Age, primitive people had already inhabited this place and left behind the awe-inspiring stone town of Avebury, only to disappear without a trace later on. Around 800 BC, a branch of Celts came from continental Europe and settled here, forming the main indigenous population of Britain. These Celtic natives correspond to the first men in Westeros. While classical civilizations were flourishing on the European continent, Britain was still an uncivilized place. But precisely because it was backward and primitive, with wild customs, Rome found it difficult to conquer this land despite its unstoppable momentum. Rome wanted to conquer all of Britain, but could only manage half of it after great efforts. Those who have watched the Eagle of the Ninth Cohort know that the Ninth Legion was a renowned unit during the late Roman Republic and early Empire era, founded by Pompey and fought alongside Caesar and Augustus. However, in one campaign deep into northern Britain, the entire legion vanished as if they had evaporated from thin air, becoming a great mystery in military history, indicating how formidable the local tribes were. In frustration, Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of a wall right down the middle of Britain to consolidate southern victories and resist the southward advance of northern barbarians. This is the famous Hadrian's Wall, which inspired the wall in Game of Thrones. Under Roman rule, southern Great Britain was upgraded into Britannia province of Rome, enjoying several centuries of prosperity until the 5th century when Rome fell to Germanic invaders. As the Western Empire crumbled under pressure from various fronts, including the Goths and Huns, the far-flung province of Britannia could not escape either. The Angles and Saxons, a branch of Germanic tribes, invaded Britain. With Rome struggling even on its own continent, it had no choice but to abandon Britain, leaving local Britons to fend for themselves against invaders. At this time, a hero named Arthur appeared. He pulled the legendary sword from the stone, led the Knights of the Round Table to fight off invaders, and even helped the Scottish king defeat his enemies, earning him the hand of the grateful Princess Guinevere in marriage. Thus, Arthur united all of Great Britain and even ventured into Europe to establish unprecedented achievements. Sadly, however, King Arthur ultimately fell victim to court intrigue, leading to the disintegration of his kingdom. This is the legendary story of King Arthur, but unfortunately, it is entirely a fabrication by medieval authors. Historical records show no evidence for Arthur, Guinevere, the Knights of the Round Table, or Camelot. However, the real-life Britons who resisted Germanic invaders after being abandoned by Rome did exist, so Arthur can be seen as an embodiment of these brave ancestors. Moving on, it is clear that the Anglo-Saxons correspond to the Andals in Game of Thrones. In Got lore, the Andals invaded Westeros from Essos and clashed with the first men there. Southern kingdoms were eventually destroyed by the Andals, while only the north managed to fend them off and remain independent. This is exactly what happened in real Britain. Despite Celtic resistance, Anglo-Saxons conquered southern Britain and established England as their land. The term English narrowly refers to these Anglo-Saxon immigrants. However, in northern Scotland, Celts retained control of their territory. Hence, it is no surprise that Scots and Englishmen have always viewed each other unfavorably. In Got's finale, the Stark-controlled North declares independence from the South. But both northern and southern kings are Starks, so I guess if the story continued, after several generations when the southern king had no heirs, his nephew or cousin would inherit the throne, who just happens to be the northern king as well. Thus, the northern king rules over both kingdoms, eventually uniting them again. This is how British history unfolded. After conquering Britain in the 5th century, Anglo-Saxons established around 10 small kingdoms here and entered the Anglo-Saxon era. Over the next 4 centuries, larger kingdoms gradually annexed smaller ones until 7 major kingdoms emerged: Kent, Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, Essex, Sussex, and Wessex. Hence, from the 5th to the 9th century, this period in British history is known as the Heptarchy. Yes, These are the prototypes of the seven kingdoms in Got. However, Anglo-Saxon rule over Britain was not without worries because winter is coming. Of course, there were no White Walkers in reality. Invading northern Britain were Vikings from Scandinavia's frigid north. But Vikings likely inspired the others in Got due to their tall stature. She has skin as white as snow and blue eyes. During the 9th and 10th centuries Danish Chauchat-led Vikings swept across Britain, ravaging the land for nearly 3 centuries and bringing about the collapse of most Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Only King Alfred of Wessex was able to turn the tide against the Vikings, forcing them to agree to a treaty that established clear boundaries and barred them from further incursions. Decades later, Alfred's grandson Athelstan ascended to the throne and became the first person in history to unify all of Great Britain. Sadly, just 5 years after his reign began, this great king fell at the peak of his power. After Athelstan's death, the lords who had once submitted to him started causing trouble again, and the Vikings returned as well. At the beginning of the 11th century, Danish King Knut established an empire that included Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and England. But after Knut's death, England regained its independence. Edward the Confessor, a descendant of Alfred the Great, became the new King of England. However, at this point, the Anglo-Saxon dynasty was already showing signs of decline. Edward had promised his cousin William, Duke of Normandy, that he would be his successor, but after Edward's death, Harold Godwinson inherited the throne instead. William waited in vain and finally became furious when he got such a result. He then marched over with his army and engaged in battle. In the end, Duke William of Normandy indeed succeeded in claiming the English crown and earned himself the title William the Conqueror. Since William was previously known as the Duke of Normandy, historians refer to this conquest as the Norman Conquest, leading England into the Norman era. From here on out, it is clear that William the Conqueror corresponds to Aegon in the game, and the Norman dynasty is akin to the Targaryen one. Now let us delve into Anglo-Saxon society in Britain at that time. It was mainly based on Germanic communal systems, but with the Norman conquest, European feudalism was brought over by William. After taking control of Britain, he confiscated vast amounts of land from Anglo-Saxon nobles and distributed it to his own followers, establishing a hierarchical order similar to France. This way, a firm lord-vassal relationship was established between the English king and various feudal lords, strengthening royal power and gradually transforming England into one of Europe's most influential nations. However, as time went on, when Henry I ascended to the throne, there was an internal conflict within the royal family. As he had no sons, he designated his daughter Matilda as heir, but his nephew Stephen stepped forward to contest her claim. After a series of battles, Matilda's son with the French Count of Anjou Henry II took the throne and initiated the Plantagenet dynasty. Resolving this crisis, the Norman royal family came from France, and so did the Plantagenets. This clearly shows that there were always intricate ties between England and France, which laid the groundwork for future conflicts such as the 100 Years' War. By 1328, when French King Philip IV died, his 3 sons had already passed away, leaving the throne to an heir from outside the family line. Coincidentally, this heir was none other than Edward III of England. Some might think that if the English king inherited the French crown and united both countries, it would be great. But given the centuries-long conflicts between France and England, their relationship was as sour as Korea's with Japan. So when French nobles thought about an English ruler governing them, they felt disgusted. Thus Edward III, dreaming of ruling grand old France, could forget about it. The French nobles quickly elected Philip IV, nephew Philip to the throne, leaving Edward III in Britain and reclaiming his lands in France. This infuriated Edward III, who launched a war against France. And so began one of history's longest wars, the 100 Years' War. In its first phase, under Edward III's leadership, England made significant territorial gains and even captured the French king in 1356. Forcing France to sign the humiliating Treaty of Bretigny, putting Britain at an advantage. But when Charles V, known as the Wise King, ascended to the throne, the tide turned using guerrilla tactics. France forced England to relinquish its gains and regained the upper hand. However, internal strife within the French royal family then split it into two factions, those supporting the king, the Armagnacs, and those wanting independence, the Burgundians, the latter even allied with England. This put Britain back in a favourable position. But then Joan of Arc emerged, igniting patriotic fervour among the French people and bringing about reconciliation between the Burgundian faction and the royal family. France once again gained an upper hand. After a century-long tug of war, French forces finally reclaimed their territories, leaving England unable to continue fighting. The 100 Years' War concluded with Britain's defeat. This led to political chaos in 15th century Britain as the Plantagenet dynasty split into two branches, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, each vying for the throne due to their respective heraldic symbols. So this war is also called the War of the Roses. And the War of the Roses is actually where a lot of classic scenes in Game of Thrones come from. At first, the throne was in the hands of Henry VI of the House of Lancaster. Although Henry VI was king, he was both incompetent and sickly. So the nobles let Richard, Duke of York, be the regent. But Richard only did it for a year before he lost to Queen Margaret in political struggles and was chased out of court by her. Of course, Richard wasn't too happy about this, so he led his family, the House of York, to rebel against the Lancasters for the throne, and that is how both families officially went to war. In one battle, Richard and his fourth son were beheaded by Queen Margaret's party and hung on spears as a warning. But then Richard's son Edward managed to capture London and crowned himself King Edward IV, putting the House of York back in power. However, Edward IV made a serious political mistake when he betrayed his most important ally, the Earl of Warwick's marriage proposal, and secretly married a beautiful widow instead. So the Earl of Warwick became an enemy of Edward IV, leading to another series of wars. Although Edward IV managed to keep his throne after several military conflicts, after his death, his brother Richard still declared his marriage invalid and imprisoned his two sons in the Tower of London as illegitimate children before crowning himself King Richard III. But no matter what, Richard III was still from the House of York, so it seemed like the Yorks won in the end. Yet who would have thought that during this period when the York brothers were fighting each other, Henry Tudor, a descendant of the House of Lancaster, had been building strength in Europe all along. So eventually, before Richard III could even get comfortable on the Iron Throne, he was overthrown by Henry Tudor. And thus Henry Tudor crowned himself King Henry VII, and after marrying Elizabeth from the House of York, changed his family emblem to this one, officially ending the War of the Roses, which caused a lot of noble deaths and starting the Tudor dynasty.